My honor and pleasure to be here with Rabbi Laura Geller, who has served for decades as a pulpit rabbi, as an author in the Hillel world, in Jewish civil rights work and broader civil rights work, and is someone I'm in awe of for many reasons. But just looking at the history as the third woman in the Reform movement to be ordained a rabbi and the fourth in the country, and what was presumed to be the fourth in the world until learning was the fifth, because this last Shabbat was the yahrzeit of Regina Jonas, who perished in the Shoah, in the Holocaust, and was in fact the first in the world, it appears. So thank you for taking this time to talk.
It is my pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
So this is a special Shabbat because this past yesterday we read the Torah portion Bereshit, which is the now official yahrzeit of the very first woman who was ever ordained a rabbi, Rabbi Regina Jonas. I went to rabbinical school. I was ordained in 1976, and I never heard her story until some years ago when I was privileged to be in a delegation of women rabbis and other leaders organized by the Jewish Women's Archives and the American Jewish Historical Society to honor her memory. And there was a delegation, and we went to Theresienstadt and inaugurated a plaque. I'd like to read what was written on the plaque. Regina Jonas, 1902 to 1944, the first woman rabbi in history, spoke these words in a sermon at Theresian. To be blessed by God means to give wherever one steps in every life situation, blessing, kindness, and faithfulness. Born in Berlin, Jonas was ordained in 1935. She served the Jewish community of Berlin in a rabbinical capacity from 1937 through November 1942, when she was deported to Theresian. With extraordinary spiritual strength, she continued to preach uplifting sermons, give lectures, and provide pastoral care to her fellow prisoners. In October 1944, she was deported to Auschwitz, where she was murdered. We've chosen this week to be her yahrzeit because she was most likely murdered immediately upon arriving in Auschwitz, and it would have been this week. What's amazing to me about her story is that there were other people there who survived Theresian who probably remembered her. Some of them were pretty famous rabbis, but they didn't tell her story. Viktor Frankl was there, others as well. And the question is why this story was never told. We'll never know. Her story only came to light after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when her papers were discovered in an East German archive. When I was in Theresian, I saw those papers. She wrote her rabbinic thesis, Can a Woman Be a Rabbi According to Halachic Sources? She was ordained independently, and it is very clear that all of the rest of the women rabbis, and now there are many of us, are standing on her shoulders.
Wow.
So I do want to begin by acknowledging
Thank
and
you.
remembering.
So our conversation will be in her memory today.
I'm sorry, it was the American Jewish Archives that also sponsored the trip.
So looking at your own experience, what was it like being one of the first women rabbis in the movement and in the country and in the world in the 70s and 80s, and how is that different from now?
Well, first of all, at the beginning, there were very few of us. Yeah. I was, in fact, the third in the Reform movement and the only woman in my class. And it is also true that in those early years, in 1976, when I was ordained, I became the rabbi at Hillel at the University of Southern California, and I gave a lot of talks about what it means to be a woman rabbi, exactly in a way the same kind of talks that I'm sure Regina Jonas, Rabbi Jonas also gave. And there was a classic moment when a very well-known Jewish radio personality, whose name I will not mention, invited me to be on his radio show to talk about the conflict between Judaism and feminism. And in a very heated argument, he at one point said, well, Rabbi Geller, what's more important to you, your Judaism or your feminism? And I said, Well, let me ask you a question. What's more important to you, your heart or your liver? I was never invited back on that show. So,
Yes.
in the early years, there was a lot of pushback. In 1980, an organization called the Women's Rabbinic Network was created. These were women rabbis in the Reform movement. And none of us had been called to serve as senior rabbis of large congregations, and we wanted to find out why. So we sent out a survey where we asked senior rabbis and members of boards of congregations what the problem was. And here's what we discovered. This is really what we discovered. This accumulated fears of congregants, boards, and senior rabbis in regard to the hiring of women as rabbis. Among the apprehensions cited were a basic fear that women couldn't do the job because the rigors of the rabbinate are too great and women are too weak for the demanding routine. The Torah is too heavy. Women are too soft-spoken. Women do not know how to nor care to wield power or authority. Women will need to be protected by the board or senior rabbi in confrontational situations. Women will cry at meetings when pressured or criticized. Women will create more work for the senior rabbi because congregants won't want to employ the services of women for certain events. Plus, the senior rabbi won't want to call her late at night in dread of pulling her away from family responsibilities. So that was one set of fears. Another was a fear that women in the rabbinate will not be able to balance a career and a personal life because their first priority would be to family, and therefore when they got pregnant or their husbands were transferred, they would leave their jobs, or that their work would lead to dissension in their families. There were other kinds of concerns. Let me just read two more. One
It's
was,
interesting which were connected to misogyny and just patriarchy in general, and which were deeply connected that and connected to sociological factors of the time.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. The fear of the unfamiliar, the untoward aesthetic of seeing a woman carrying a Torah or reading a kippah. And finally, and this one turned out to be true as opposed to all the others, a fear of women succeeding. Women who succeed will reflect poorly on their colleagues. If women can read from the Torah, preach, and teach, the rabbi's duties become accessible to everyone. The mystique is lost. This possibility leads to the breakdown of the hierarchy of the rabbi-congregant relationship. And it turns out that it's true that the ordination of women has led to the breakdown of the hierarchy of the rabbi-congregant relationship. And I think a lot of what you can see about the changes in American Judaism, and particularly in North American Judaism, over the past 50 years, has had a great deal to do with what it means when women come to be leaders and lead in some significant ways differently from men.
So when you were my understanding is the first woman rabbi of a major named senior rabbi of a major metropolitan area synagogue. Did people leave when you were hired? I mean, what kinds of challenges did you encounter in your first years?
So people didn't leave. I think some people were not so sure about it. I have a classic memory of a woman coming up to me after my first sermon. Said, I'd lived in Los Angeles. I'd been a Hill director. I'd been the director of the American Jewish Congress. People knew me by reputation. So I wasn't a stranger to the congregation, even though I hadn't been in this particular congregation. A woman came up to me and said, I hear wonderful things about you, and I'm sure you're very talented, but I don't believe in women rabbis. So what I've learned mostly in my life is that you need to have a sense of humor. I didn't exactly know what that meant. Is it like I don't believe in the Easter Bunny? Here I am standing in front of her, a woman rabbi. And I basically said, well, let's learn together and see what happens. Yeah. And years later, she came to me and apologized and said, I was wrong, and I'm really glad that you were a leader of our congregation. Yeah. Yeah. It is true that under my leadership, the congregation changed in many ways. My partnership with my colleague, who is now my successor, was very collaborative. There was really not a sense of hierarchy. There was no sense that, an assistant rabbi comes in and then leaves.
Yeah.
I remember early in my time at the congregation, I went to the leadership of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. I had found this wonderful colleague, Rabbi Jonathan Aaron, and I said to these leaders, what's the career path for someone who begins as an assistant and someday will be the senior successor? And they said to me, you don't want that. You want fresh blood. Every 5 years you want a new assistant. And I said, no, actually I don't. I want to develop a relationship with this very talented man, and I want this collaboration to make the synagogue a wonderful synagogue. And that's what we did. And now I am a congregant in the congregation where Jonathan is the senior rabbi, and we have a wonderful associate rabbi, and I'm very proud to be in that congregation.
Nice.
So it's a different model, and I think there's lots of models that have evolved from women's leadership, including co-rabbinates. And the empowerment of women has really been transformative, not just in the Reform and Conservative movement, the Orthodox movement as well. It's a different, feminism has changed North American Judaism. I think the focus on spirituality has a lot to do with the energy that came into the community because of the leadership of women rabbis and women scholars and teachers. Because the kinds of... So Jewish feminism, in my view, unfolded in kind of two waves. The first was about equal access in 1972. And earlier, the question was, can women be counted in a minyan?
Right.
If they can be counted in a minyan, what can they do? These were questions of equal access. At the same time, in the secular movement, the questions were, can women be lawyers? Women getting into different kinds of professions. As that became resolved, and women were counted in the minyan, and there was women were beginning to be admitted into rabbinical school. The next question was, well, now that women can be rabbis, what kind of rabbis ought they be?
Right.
And what kinds of questions come about because of this kind of new energy? So, for example,
I think of Carol Gilligan's In a Different Voice.
Right.
What's the novelty that's brought that enhances us?
And that's problematic because it's a kind of essentialist argument.
That's right.
But what does happen is that when women became rabbis, it challenged people's vision of God. Because while people didn't admit they were doing this, very often people projected onto their rabbi their image of God.
Right.
And if your rabbi was a man with a beard and a deep voice, you didn't even notice you were making that projection. But when your rabbi is a woman, all of a sudden you have to stop and say, well, what do I think about God? And so all kinds of questions about theology emerged. Judith Plaskow's book, Standing Again at Sinai, a very rich period in thinking about theology and feminist theology. And as you begin to think about theology, then the next question is, how do we speak to God?
Yeah.
And so the whole issue of prayer emerges and the language of prayer. And then the question of ritual. It turns out that when women rabbis are in the story, all of a sudden people start thinking about, well, there's a covenant ceremony when a boy is born. Well, why not when a girl is born?
Right.
The first covenant ceremony for a baby girl was in 1972 in Response magazine. So, again, this is like the beginning of this energy of what I would call sort of second wave Jewish feminism. And now you have all kinds of rituals. When I was a young Hillel director, a young woman came to me and she told me she'd had an abortion and she wanted to say Kaddish. And I told her she couldn't say Kaddish because Kaddish implied that she had murdered a human being, and Jewish views about abortion is much more complicated than that. It was clear she needed to do something but that wasn't the something she needed to do. And so we created a ritual for her to acknowledge her grief and loss.
Yeah.
And it was a new ritual. And, from that moment on, people have been creating new rituals. Rituals for miscarriage, rituals for when a girl first gets her period. I mean, my kind of classic story, which I've told many times, is I began to think about this when I was a second-year student in the New York School at the Hebrew Union College, again, the only woman in my class. And our wonderful Talmud professor introduces us to Tractate Brachot, which, as you know, is a tractate about blessings. And he says, there's no important moment in the lifetime of a Jew for which there is no blessing. And I am sitting in the class and I'm thinking, oh, that's so wonderful. There's no important moment in the lifetime of a Jew for which there's no blessing. And then I thought, but it isn't true. And there I was in my classroom with these supportive, lovely classmates, all of whom were men, and I'm thinking, God, when I first got my period, there was no blessing.
Right.
What would have happened if there were a blessing?
Right.
My mother and I had prepared for this moment. I knew what was happening in my body, but what if we had prepared also spiritually, so that when that moment came, we would be able to say together, Asher Yanu.
Yeah.
Or, thank you, God, for making my body work properly.
Right.
How would that have changed my sense of myself as a woman, my comfort in my own body, and my sense of what it means to be a woman in Jewish tradition? So once you start thinking like that, what are those other kinds of moments? In those days, these were, Xerox rituals, or that machine that you ran things off, and now they're in the prayer books, and they're in the rabbis' manuals of our movements. I mean, it's an extraordinary transformation that has taken place. So one other story that I want to tell, and I think it was in 1978. The Central Conference of American Rabbis convention was right here in Arizona, which was not an ERA state. And people were boycotting coming to Arizona because of that. At that time, there were maybe 6 or 8 women rabbis. Our convention was in Arizona. What do? We wanted to be at the convention because we wanted our colleagues to begin to see us as colleagues and as rabbis. On the other hand, we didn't want to come to a place where the ERA was not recognized. So we didn't know what to do. So I called Betty Friedan and said, what should we do? She took my call. And she said, you absolutely should go to the convention. You should invite me to speak. We'll have a rump convention. So Betty Friedan came to that convention, and that was the first time she made the connection between her Jewishness and her feminism. So there is a deep connection between the history of the feminist movement, so many Jewish women leaders, and the role that rabbis and scholars have played in shaping American and now international Judaism.
Wow. So going back to your response to that radio host of The Heart and the Liver, how do you experience the relationship between Judaism and feminism for you on an ethical, theological, textual level? I mean, it may feel fairly obvious to us, but for those who haven't fleshed it out in Jewish language, I wonder sort of how do you root that connection?
Well, it's actually quite timely because, again, it's the very beginning of Torah, right? In this Torah portion that we read yesterday morning, where in the first story of creation, it says, let us make the human being in our image. In the image of God, God created him. Male and female, God created them. So, however you understand that, there's an image of an androgynous creation. There's an image, perhaps, that the first human being, Ha-Adam, the human being, was both male and female. And when God wanted to create a man and a woman, God split the original Adam, and there was a man and there was a woman. That's one way people make sense out of the two different creation
Yeah.
stories, the Adam and Eve story as opposed to the 7 days of creation story. However you want to read that, though,
Yeah.
it's clear that all of us are created in the image of God.
Yeah.
And if all of us are created in the image of God, that's the lens that I read Torah, through which I read Torah.
Right.
So
right.
when I confront passages
Yeah.
that are misogynistic,
Right.
texts of terror, I read them with the understanding that human beings reflected a culture that was patriarchal or misogynistic, but that the divine expansiveness is one where all human beings are created in the image of God. And one of the really important things that has happened in these years since I was ordained is the idea of feminist scholarship that asks different kinds of questions. So we now have the Women's Torah Commentary that was created by now Rabbi Tamar Ashkenazi and Andrea Weiss, which in each Torah portion asks, where were the women? What does this tell us about the experience of women? Women were part of the Jewish community from the very beginning. They just were not writing the story. I mean, it's interesting that when I was ordained in 1976, the year before the Gates of Prayer, the Reformed Prayer Book came out, and in its introduction, it said that it was an inclusive prayer book. What made it inclusive was that it said, God of our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and our mothers, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. The acknowledgement that women are actually part of the Jewish community. I mean, it's so obvious, but it wasn't part of our liturgical tradition. And in the conservative movement, you know, it took a while, much longer for that to be included as an option in Sim Shalom. It was a radical statement in 1975. It was long before people began to think about different metaphors for God. I mean, now in the most recent and really beautiful Reform Machzor, High Holiday Prayer Book, there are all these different images of God that, you know, so far transcend the image of Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, that people can discover the divinity in their own experience, whatever it is, whether they experience the world as a woman or as a man or, you know, as in some kind of gender fluid situation. It's extraordinary, the changes that have taken place. And so back to your question, there are texts of terror. I am not someone who believes that we shouldn't read those texts of terror. I think it's really important to not, you know, skip over them, but to actually confront them. So, for example, and, you know, to get a little contemporary, there's the horrible story about the rape of Dinah in the book of Genesis. You know, you could not read it, or you could read it and say, what does it mean that in this whole story of a violation of a woman, or maybe it was more complicated, the bottom line is no one ever asks her what her experience is. She was silent. And what happened to her was understood as a crime against her brothers and against her father. What does it mean to acknowledge now, in this world that we are struggling with issues of women's voices and Me Too, to confront a biblical story in which women had no voice? And there are a lot of other texts of terror in our Hebrew Bible where women not only have no voice, but you know, horrible things happen. Now, I do not in any way believe that God wants those horrible things to happen, but rather to acknowledge that they happen because we're not listening, and because the voices of people who don't have power, and in this case women, are not being heard. I mean, another story that's in people's minds because of the holidays is the story of Hagar and Sarah. Sarah is threatened by Hagar and her child, kicks them out, and God seems to take Sarah's side. God says to Abraham, listen to her voice. And then Abraham exiles his first son, sending him off to what most likely will be death, right? But that isn't what God said. God said, listen to her voice.
Yeah.
Maybe if Abraham and Sarah had sat down and he had said, well, what does it feel like? Maybe there could have been a different kind of conversation eventually between Sarah and Hagar. Listen to her voice. Doesn't necessarily tell you what you have to do, but it begins with listening. And I think that's a very powerful thing that our tradition teaches us.
So going back to the creation story for just a moment, the text, the Midrashim around being an androgynous being. I saw this beautiful, powerful Zohar on Shabbat that says that the androgynous being was created b'tselem Elohim and in the image of God, and once separated, if they are not one, then Adam is not Adam. Essentially, a human is not a human, or a man is not a man. Right? That actually the equality of being in solidarity is constitutive of our very humanity. And once separated, that distinctness is important, but if not unified in a sense, then we lose that very humanity that makes us b'tselem Elohim in a sense. So I think that's of how much we need each other, and this notion that we see among many men of I can only be greater if I push down, right, actually denies their very humanity in a sense. So I guess my last question for you, in the interest of time, even though I could ask you all night, is 2018 America. What is the most pressing charge right now? What if feminism? We've run through a few decades, even beyond Judaism. Just looking at American culture, what is our role as women and as men that we should be most conscious of and on the front lines to address?
Well, I'm not sure that I can answer the larger question, but in the light of recent news, I do think it is important that we acknowledge that in our community there are real issues of sexual harassment and limitations that are put on women, and some really painful stories that have been shared by women in safe Facebook settings about incredible boundary violations that have gone on, even to women rabbis, and certainly beyond. One of the things that I have felt very strongly about in this past moment is apparently 1 out of 3 American women have been victims of sexual violence or of sexual harassment. It's a huge number. And as we talk about what's happening in our political world, it's very important to acknowledge that you might be talking to somebody who herself was a victim, or even himself was a victim, and to just be sensitive to that and to recognize that. And for us as Jews to look at the culture of our institutions, where women are still silent. You look at boards of directors of Jewish institutions, and there are still many fewer women. I mean, it's a serious issue for us to address. We can't think that it's just out there. It's something that we have to pay attention to and begin to look at our own institutions and how we can change the culture of our institutions so that people's voices are heard, and that when violations occur, people are able to find safe spaces to report them, and the confidence that people who are transgressing these boundaries are going to be held accountable. It's not really happening yet, and it needs to be happening.
Beautiful. Check out Rabbi Geller's The Torah of My Life. Very powerful book here, minus the fruit bars. And coming out soon, Getting Good at Getting Older, a Jewish catalog for a new stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you.